Hello, good evening everyone, and welcome to the IWM, the Institute für die Wissenschaften vom Menschen in German, the Institute for Human Sciences. It's great to see you all here. This is a very special occasion. It's also a special occasion for us because this week marked the 10th anniversary of Krzysztof Michalski's death, the founder of the IWM, and so it's been a moment for reflection for all of us here, and we marked it with a very moving commemorative evening earlier this week. But as I said, this is a special week because of that, but also because of today's event, which I'm extremely pleased to be able to introduce. Before I do, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you, in particular to my predecessor, Shalini Randeria, who is now, of course, the rector of the CEU. And I'd also like to welcome one of her predecessors as rector of the CEU, Michael Ignatieff is here. Is Boris Marta here? Is Boris here? He's not here yet. I was going to welcome Boris from the Erste Foundation as well, one of our most important donors and supporters. And also former EU Commissioner Franz Fischler is here. Welcome, Dr. Fischler. Very pleased to see you here at the IWM. So, this really is a special evening. I'm honored to present Jim O'Brien. Jim O'Brien joined the State Department in 1989 as an attorney and a diplomatic advisor. He was later appointed Special Presidential Envoy for the Balkans, and I can testify to everyone here that his work in the Balkans has been absolutely critical and very effective over many decades. After that, for a while, he was deputy head of the Office of Policy Planning at the State Department. He joined Madeleine Albright's staff as a special advisor when she was the ambassador to the United Nations and when she was Secretary of State. And of course, Jim played an important role in the managing of the Dayton Peace Accords, the peace agreement of November 1995, in which, where Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina agreed to come to a peace deal. Later on, perhaps you may not know, he was appointed by President Obama, the United States' first special envoy on hostage affairs from August 2015 until early 2017. But it gets even tougher for Jim O'Brien because President Biden appointed him in 2021 to be the head of the Office of Sanctions Coordination for the United States. And he was confirmed in that office by Congress in April 2022, just 6 weeks or so after the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So I really don't have to emphasize here just how important the role he's playing now is as that special ambassador. He has the rank of an ambassador. But I would once again finally stress that for those of us who've worked on the Balkans, it's people like Jim O'Brien who've really made things happen when they've needed to happen. And so it's a personal honor and pleasure to introduce Jim this evening. And he's going to speak for about 25 minutes, half an hour or so. And then I will hand the floor to Ivan Krastev, who will have a conversation with Jim in advance of a question and answer session afterwards. So Jim, allow me to invite you to the podium.
Thank you very much, Misha. I have to say, during the time I was working exclusively on the Balkans, we would all, sneak peeks at Misha's writings as a way of knowing what the history was of what we were about to do. So, and it's a great honor to be here at the Institute. I think I was last here with you about 6 or 7 years ago with Madeleine Albright, as we were trying to study the migration disputes in Europe and think about ways that the U.S. might respond constructively. Sadly, we didn't for a few years. But at this point, what I'm very pleased about is how creative and unified the transatlantic response has been to Russia's unjustified invasion of Ukraine. And that's true across all the ways in which we can respond. The humanitarian assistance we've provided, the help for Ukrainian displaced and refugee persons, the assistance we're providing to Ukraine militarily, support for the civilian budget, and in sanctions. And so I want to talk about the role that sanctions play in that wider universe. But throughout, I want to emphasize how important it is that we're doing this together and that we're all bearing the burdens of doing that full amount of support together. So we should never feel that any one of the states in our main coalition, say the 30, 36 states who are doing different things, no one is bearing this risk and costs alone, but we're looking for ways that we share this because this is, in a sense, all of our fights. This is an imperial project in Europe. I don't know that it's the last, but it's the most recent one that I've seen, and it threatens us all if we don't see it turned back. So with that as a sort of general background, what I'll try to do is just talk in 3 groups of 3, and maybe I'll make it to 25 minutes. We'll see as I go. I want to talk about the purpose of the sanctions, the effect of the sanctions, and then maybe some lessons that we can draw from Russia sanctions for the wider world. And the one caveat I'll offer, as I told Ivan when he invited me, I was excited because this is one of the audiences that will teach me much more than I impart to you. But the fact that I'm a sitting government official means I'll be much less interesting than I might be in another context. But I'll try to at least draw out some lessons that are all things we can discuss. I know that Michael Ignatieff knows what happens as soon as you become a sitting official. You're and Ivan Vejvoda are just much less intriguing and willing to speculate. So why don't I talk first about the purpose of our Russia sanctions? Then I'll go to effects and then to some broader lessons. The Russia sanctions program is very large. For those of you who follow these things, we took a look at U.S. sanctions programs in the fall of 2021, and there's a formal report by the U.S. Treasury Department about the scope and utility of economic sanctions. And at that point, they announced something over 9,000 actions, designations of individuals, institutions, and others over the lifespan, the modern lifespan of our sanctions program. We're now approaching 12,000 actions. There were more than 2,000 last year. Just to give you a sense, it meant several hundred requests of our secretary to approve, because he does approve each individual action that we take. Same is true of Secretary Yellen and the Treasury Department team. So these undergo a great deal of scrutiny. It consumes a lot of resources, and thus it has to be important for us if we're going to pursue it. Now, what are the purposes for which we're pursuing sanctions on Russia? And I'll note 3 things. 1, we're denying Russia access to resources. The fundamental vulnerability Russia has is that its military machine depends on access to really the West, to the more sophisticated economies in the world. And what we want to do is deprive Russia of the inputs for its military machinery and the resources that it can use to try to buy raw materials or other items that it will use in its military. So this is a key part of the shape of our sanctions. And you'll see over the next week, as we roll out more packages, that there's a real emphasis upon the companies, the brokers, the providers who offer up the inputs Russia needs for its military machine. Also on the financiers and others in that realm that are critical to the way that the war functions. The second purpose is to reduce our own reliance. Now, one of the stories that doesn't get told often on our side of the Atlantic is just how much progress our European partners have made in reducing their reliance on Russia, particularly for energy. It's been remarkable in Italy, Germany, elsewhere. Austria's got a particular case, but has nevertheless taken steps to begin diversifying. And I think we look across Europe, there's a lot less vulnerability now to Russian pressure. This is a key part of how we design the sanctions, because it's not simply restrictions on Russian entities, but upon ourselves. So the heart of the oil price decline recently was first a decision by the European Union to ban imports of Russian oil to itself. And with that, we're in a sense binding ourselves to the mast, because we have also banned imports of Russian oil, as have the UK and Canada and others. So the result of that is that we are saying in the future we want to be much less reliant on Russia than we have been to this point. There's no returning to the last generation where Russia was a sort of consistent provider of low-cost energy and then the influence that came with that role. There's similar trends in other commodities as well, whether it's energy commodities like coal, but also restrictions on purchasing Russian gold. We'll see, I think, restrictions on diamonds, on down the list, so that our economies and our societies should emerge from this war much less susceptible to influence from Russia than we were when it started. The third purpose, we want to maintain global markets. So Russia has emerged as a really significant supplier, especially to the global south, of food and fertilizer, oil and gas, some metals. And those are important to continue flowing. Why? Because we don't want the uninvolved, the innocent people of the world to suffer from this war more than they have. I mean, when Russia invaded Ukraine, these were 2 of the top 5 suppliers of grain globally going to war, one invading the other and taking it off the market. That drove up food prices to levels we haven't seen for decades. Now, we've done a lot to try to restore the normal functioning of those markets, and I'll talk a little more about that later. But our purpose is to keep Russia on the market for those global commodities. And you notice those 3 things. Let's draw a couple of inferences from them. One of them is we're not pursuing any one of those 3 purposes to the maximum extent. This is intended to be a relatively stable 3-legged stool, right, where it balances off each other. And that allows for a calibration when we look at, are we going too far in denying Russia resources that we're threatening to take products off the market in a way that will hurt innocent people. All of these things provide a little sense of, if not self-regulation, at least benchmarks for us to use in evaluating the sanctions that we're putting in place. It helps explain sometimes to some of our friends who say, why aren't you, say, stopping Russia from selling oil altogether? Because the global community has a stake in some of these matters. And so we're attempting to strike the right balance between those. The second piece of this is we're trying to pass along a message to Russia. These 3 elements I talked about are attributes of superpower status, I think in President Putin's mind. The ability to coerce, to have the resources to coerce or influence one's neighbors. The ability to give or take resources, either to premium markets like the European Union and the United States, or to poorer markets. These are all kind of part of what it means to have global influence. Every day it gets more difficult for him to do those things because we are pursuing these goals. Why does it get more difficult? Well, he's got fewer resources, which I'll talk about, and fewer military means than he had. He's now not able to influence our societies, and he's increasingly counting his global stature by his ability to provide reliably oil and food and other items to the global south. So the influence, the gift of the czar to give or to take is being removed from him. And that starts to tell you something about the shape of this conflict going forward. What we're seeing is Russia suffering a strategic defeat. It's a core goal. Not only we want to see Ukraine win, but Russia to suffer a strategic defeat from this imperial project. And those are the purposes behind the sanctions program. Now notice one thing we're not doing, and I'll touch on this a little later, we're not seeking to harm the Russian population or collapse the Russian economy. Many of the actions that would be available to us if those were our goals, we're not taking. We're not targeting Russian employment centers. We're not seeking to have innocent civilians harmed by what we're doing. We're very focused on the things that support the military machine and the broader imperial project. So other sets of sanctions that you'll see are those that highlight the criminality and the violence intrinsic to this imperial project. So we designate people involved in stealing children from their families, people involved in the filtration system, people involved in the illegal annexation, in the atrocities that we see around Ukraine and the annexed territories. Increasingly now we're touching Russian officials as they attempt to incorporate the occupied territories into the Russian establishment. It means that the governors who've been charged with carrying out some of these tasks now fall within our mandate, and also the technical agencies in Russia that are attempting to lock in Russian payment systems, telephone systems, all of the things that go with this, again, imperial project are within what we're trying to do. But we're not targeting ordinary Russians in any way. And I think when you read the reports about how sanctions work or they don't, one consistent theme throughout is that ordinary Russians have seen their access to Western technology decline, but we believe Russia is more than able to continue to feed, employ, and provide for its people in an adequate way. So those are all points about the purposes of what we're doing. Now, how well are we doing this? What are the impact of sanctions? And I think this is a question that's important in all the audiences that we address, because people wonder, why are we doing this if the war continues? And I think we want to be clear about the impacts that we do see and those that are perhaps less important. So a few items. For me, the most important marker is Russia's success or failure on the battlefield. So what we hope to see from this is a real impact on Russia's ability to carry out its campaign. And here, what I'd ask you all to look at are the tactics that Russia uses. Russia is fighting a war that is older and older. It doesn't use modern technologies. It doesn't use modern tactics. It doesn't have access to the electronics, the communications equipment, the optics, the other things that are a key part of the precision weaponry and rapid movement and rapid response that typify the way that Ukraine is fighting. That is largely because Russia doesn't have access to those items. Before the war, Russia depended on the West for 90% of the key electronics in many of its weapon systems. And for several months after the war, it had very little access to those. Had some stockpiles, but very little access. We saw production numbers go far down. Russia is trying to find a way back to resupplying itself on those items. It has to do that through unfamiliar vendors, through routes that aren't direct, they're more costly, and very often it has to buy older technology or technology that's not fit for purpose, that it has to adapt to fit into the military. So that, again, makes Russia less capable of fighting the kind of war that it set out to fight at the beginning. So I measure success there by the tactics that we see Russia deploying, and also by the anecdotes that we receive from the battlefield. We know that in cases where Ukraine has a technological advantage over Russia, it has an enormous edge in the way that it approaches or it emerges from particular battles, whether it's firing missiles at towns or fighting on the ground. Russia is attempting to compensate, both by getting access to electronics from other sources, and this will be a major focus of our work over the next weeks, where we will encourage third countries not to engage in business with the Russian military in that way, and we'll take steps to make sure that things are not leaking from our own economies. But it's also, I think, a crucial part of looking at the next months, where Russia wants to have quantity of poor quality overcome quality and commitment on the Ukrainian side. And so we'll have to measure how well this works as we move forward. But on the whole, we see the production in Russia of the inputs crucial for the military down several percent. And this, I think, tells you something, because normally at the end of a year of a war that's had incredible usage of artillery and other inputs, other weapon systems, you would expect to see production going very far up. Instead, Russia is sort of working to maintain pre-war levels. It can maintain its civilian economy, hence its GDP, stays as it is. But the measurement for us is it able to deliver this on the battlefield? Because that's the heart of the project, and we don't see it. Now, another effect we look at is whether Russia has adequate capital and the ability to allocate it where it needs it. And Russia has fantastic financial managers in its economy. So over the last year, we've seen them be very adept at using pre-war reserves to shore up civilian production and demand. But I think the strains are beginning to show. And if we just look at it, I'm going to use a particular set of numbers. There are others, but I think this gives you a sense of the scale. When this war began, Russia had probably $850 billion or so, sort of disposable cash. 640 was saved up in national reserves, the wealth fund, the Ministry of Finance, the central bank. And then it could expect to earn another couple $100 billion from its exports. Remember last year, record prices of food, fuel, the items that it exported. So altogether, you could look in February, look ahead to having that amount to spend. When we look at the start of this year, it looks a lot more bleak. And we think Russia started the year, last year it began with, say, 640 billion in ready reserves. It begins this year with about 580 billion. That by itself is fairly remarkable. For a year in which it earned record amounts by exporting, it somehow depleted its reserves by $60 billion. So that tells you something about the burn rate, right? The rate it has to spend in order to maintain a war economy while it has its population working as well. But then let's look at that 580 billion. 300 billion of it is immobilized abroad. Russia had put almost half its central bank reserves outside the country for normal financial management reasons. Those are immobilized, so they're not available. So now they have 280 billion. We think about a third of that is in renminbi. Okay, useful trading partner, but again, not very liquid, not able to reach around the globe. About a third of that or more is in gold, not particularly liquid, and there are measures in place to begin reducing the way that Russia can deploy this gold around the world. So that leaves it with maybe, 120 billion or so, 100, 120 billion, it's a rough estimate, in liquid cash, plus whatever it earns from its exports. But one of the problems it has is that its export numbers are very far down. When you look at the decline in the price of oil, some of which is from the discipline imposed by the price cap, and even more by removing our economies from the buyer pool, Russia's earning much less. So there are different ways of counting, but our estimate is in January this year, Russia's revenues, the fiscal revenues from taxes, so ultimately what went to the Russian budget, they had declined 48% from January of 22 to January of 23. Which means for this year, rather than, say, earning 220 billion as it did in 2022, I think maybe it'll earn 100, 120 billion. So all of a sudden, you're looking at liquid cash that is about, 30% of what it was at the start of the war. And that forces some difficult decisions on an economy. So they can try to borrow, but they can only borrow internally, which creates its own set of economic strains. They can't borrow internationally. Or they have to start changing their spending patterns. So they're on a war footing. They have to pay for war production. So that's a certain stimulus, but it means then they have to take money out of other parts of the economy. So if you look at the Russian budget, they're not spending money on any of the kind of investments that a normal economy would make in infrastructure, education, et cetera. So they're eating their seed corn, as our chief economist, Emily Blanchard, says, in preparing for the future. But they're also incapable of paying for the kind of increases in pensions and other things that have been used to mollify the population. So these are very difficult choices that are coming on Russia, and they're being forced to make them more quickly and more often, maybe at a time we choose rather than a time they choose. It's also in an environment where they have fewer tools to manage the economy, and that's in part because, again, of the sanctions. What the sanctions often aim to do is remove elements of the financial system. So many Russian banks have been designated by the EU, by the UK, US. There will be more. And the effect of that often is to make it more difficult for the central bank to deploy cash in the way that it seeks to do so domestically. And that just adds to sort of sludge within the system that makes life more difficult. All of that takes place against an economy that is moving toward a steep hill, if not a cliff. So we've seen the estimates of the GDP. Again, it's a war economy where they're pumping a lot of money into their economy. Russia's rich enough that it can kind of keep that rolling for a bit. But you look at the absolute scale of the economy and you see two things. Everyone agrees the decline in the next few years will be pretty sharp, could be 13 to 16% in 2 to 3 years. We think by the end of the decade, the Russian economy will be 20% smaller than it would have been otherwise had this war not happened. That's a dramatic drop. But then you start to look at the components within it, and you see that with the mass migration of very skilled workers, right? Some estimates are 900,000 people left, many of them military-age personnel who have the skills in IT and other things. And even if a few of them still work for Russian companies or may still go back home, it's at least 500,000 people who just aren't available in Russia to build the economy of the future. Now, why does that matter? Well, if I can borrow from Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, the US thinks that the economies of the future are going to grow based on their success in just a few foundational technologies. So biomanufacturing, the green revolution, artificial intelligence. That's where the next big leaps in productivity, profitability, and growth will come. And Russia's just simply not investing in or playing in those fields at all. It's providing basic commodities to often a low-cost global marketplace. So it's not simply that the economy will be overall smaller, but it's not going to be engaged in what the growth in the future will be in the areas where China is heavily investing, and now the US is heavily investing, to some comments from this side of the Atlantic, but also with the European Union, we're all working to invest it. And that's not Russia any longer. So it's in an environment now where partly, as sanctions reflect, we're showing you the shape of the future. It's a Russia as commodity provider, but not heavily invested in what the future of the economy will be. For all of that, I don't see the Russian economy collapsing. I don't think the proper measurements are all of the macroeconomic indicators alone. This isn't a sort of score sheet for your favorite professional sport where you can reduce everything to one score, one efficiency rating. It's actually a place where we don't see Russia playing in the economy of the future. So all of those things lead me to my final point that I look at in terms of the impact of sanctions, and it's generally the friction in the Russian system. Everything is harder for Russia today. So even as it has attempted to backfill by buying Western electronics through other means, even for those cases where it's successful, it's just more difficult. It costs more money. They have to find vendors. They have to route it through unfamiliar places. They have to get it to the production points at the right time in a production line. They have to adapt what they bought to fit the machinery they've got. They have to find the money and get it to move, often through unfamiliar channels. All of these things are just hard. So it's a constant tax where everything Russia tries to do is 5%, 10% more difficult. And over time, this friction, to my mind, is much like soldiers' morale is on the battlefield, because it determines how hard people work to overcome the obstacles in front of them. You can't quantify this, but it's a core part. And if you're sitting in Russia, you see tomorrow will always be worse. And at some point, it just becomes difficult to try to overcome each obstacle each time. And there will always be new obstacles because we'll continue with our sanctions programs. So that's the effect of sanctions. So I've gotten to two groups of three. I don't know where I'm doing on time. But and now I'm going to do my final group of three, which are just sort of some general lessons. And I'll have a few examples here. I'm going to apologize. I won't often use specific countries in these, but they're all backed by this. And this part is a little more experimental because my preference is to figure out our lessons, to find the rules for sanctions out of experience. And this reflects my training as a Anglo-American lawyer, where what we do is you make a bunch of decisions and then you look back, find the ones that work, and try to infer a rule from them rather than announcing a doctrine in advance. And so we're still in that process of looking to see what works and what doesn't. But I think there are a few interesting things from the time that I've been working on this so far. So the broad goal, when I was asked to take on this job by Secretary Blinken, was to look at how sanctions can always be integrated to policy. It can't be a substitute for policy. We're angry, so we're going to designate someone. It can't be an externality to policy, where we just sort of come in and disrupt events by declaring somebody persona non grata. It has to be a part of trying to achieve a goal. And the broad goal in this context is to reinforce the rule-abiding world. We're standing up for the principles of the UN Charter, the territorial integrity of states. And that's what we're looking to do in every case. Okay, but that's sort of a bromide when it's the only guidance you have. So what more are we talking about when we do this? And I'll talk about three things. The first thing is that sanctions need to be effective by whether they deny resources to the target. This isn't true of all sanctions programs in all cases, but very often that's what we're aiming to do. So the target is, say, engaging in some behavior, threatens a friend or ally, threatens the rule-based system, and we want to deny it the resources to carry out that policy. Now, that may mean a couple things. It can mean that what we want to do is disrupt the patronage system within a society. So some political group or leader is able to operate with impunity because they have taken over a piece of the judicial system. Maybe they have access to state resources. They funnel contracts to friends, have that cycle back to support the political party. Sounds familiar, right, to those of you who follow a few jurisdictions. So what we'd like to do is begin to cut apart those systems. Now, why? It's only useful if it comes with political reform behind it, that the individuals who then don't have access to the resources begin to look for participating in a wider system. So there are a few countries, say, where you maybe have two groups who have divided up the polity and they agree not to challenge one another, but they take care of their own followers, much to the detriment of the wider society. And what we would prefer to see is that those two have to come together and actually engage in politics, right? They have to engage in some common venue, accept that they're part of one state. And in this case, I'm thinking a bit about Bosnia. They have to all accept they're part of one state and then argue about the allocation of resources in a way that benefits their people. Instead, we often have three separate polities in Bosnia. Each one has control over its own resources. So what sanctions can do is say, we won't allow you to have this self-reinforcing cycle of patronage politics, and instead you have to engage in a more normal political cycle. We've begun to do that, and I think we'll see soon what kind of effect it has, but it's certainly beginning to take apart these very comfortable patronage networks that Yvonne and I have spent years talking about. The other kind of, and we've seen similar things, say in a Central American country where recently we took on a piece of the economy. Why did we choose that piece of the economy? Because it supported a particular part of the patronage network for an increasingly oppressive government. By itself, it wasn't a huge amount of either money or people, but by taking out that one piece of the patronage network, which tied into family members and friends and others, it encouraged the government there to realize that this could get worse, that we had considerable knowledge of the inner workings of the system, and that it was time to begin changing behavior. And we've seen at least some initial signs of a shift in behavior after several years of obstinance. And that, I think, is a piece of how you use sanctions. It's directly to disrupt the resources. The resources we have we can disrupt within the US sanctions program are very much US focused. We can deny people access to our dollar system, and the EU can do that with the euro, the UK can do it with the pound, and we can deny people access to our territory. In one sense, sanctions are always the ultimate defensive weapon, right? They're just a statement of who gets to come into our system. But that access is incredibly important for certain political actors. If we disrupt that access, we've got real chances of making a difference. There's a set of other examples in the Middle East and elsewhere where we're seeing some of the same progress. Now, the reason I talk about this in terms of denying resources is to distinguish it from a second case. The second case is much more a case almost of dialogue between the sanctioned party and the sanctioner, where it's very clear that what we're attempting to pursue is a specific reform path, that we're saying we will sanction this until the following things happen. And then that may be an explicit dialogue where there's an understanding from some negotiation. We see that in peace talks. So in a recent peace talk in peace talks in Africa, the negotiator was very skilled in saying that there are a number of designations that could follow from obstruction of the peace process. But if we're able to work this to achieve a ceasefire and some implementation schedule, then that may not be necessary. And that kind of leverage is an explicit discussion where behavior is modified because of the discussion of sanctions. very tightly tied together. In other cases, it may be more a bit of parallel play or a dialogue of the deaf, maybe, in a different sense, where say in one case, there was a police unit that was implicated in horrible human rights abuses, and a designation allowed us to cast a spotlight on those abuses, and it led to reform of that particular unit. What has to follow is further reform to sort of wring the abuses out of the overall system. But it's a case where the use of sanctions was directly tied to some behavioral change that we wanted. Now, why do I talk about these two things as though they're different, denying resources and provoking behavioral change? It's because they sort of apply in different circumstances. And I think some of the disputes or the discussions that go on about whether it's time for a peace process in Ukraine or not really come from a conflation of these two options. As I've described our sanctions on Russia, at the moment, what we're interested in doing is denying resources to Russia to carry out its imperial project. Now, what this does not do is build what some people call as an off-ramp. That's because, as Secretary Blinken said yesterday, we don't see that Russia's interested in one right now. And the effort for us to build one will be nothing but negotiating with ourselves. So we're interested in denying resources. I think the people who say, well, you only use sanctions if you are offering an off-ramp, you're offering a proposition to which the other person is agree, they're thinking of this other category of sanctions. And it's a sort of confusion of categories that I think leads to this dialogue sort of crossing without really grappling with each other. Now, there may come a time when we engage in that kind of behavior, but as the Secretary said yesterday, we don't see it in this case. I'm happy to provide more examples, but I think that won't add to much more here. The third lesson, or third category of sanctions that I draw from our experience, is that we want to reinforce international standards. So I think one of the tools that's come to the United States in recent years, and now many other countries have adopted some or all of it, are sanctions. We call them the global Magnitsky standards. So they're anti-corruption and responses to human rights abuses. These are standards we want to stand by, regardless of their impact in the immediate situation, because we feel if we don't send a strong message, it will simply encourage other violations, and it will undermine the international system, frankly, for which Ukraine is fighting today. And so we want, in all cases, to be clear that we will stand up for these standards. So how does this work? Well, the most obvious is when we designate people for human rights abuses, even if there's not currently a political process that would lead to effective reform directly as a result, because we need to stand up for the standards. So one area I'm very interested in, where we're hoping to work with the UN, is on the victims of sexual violence and armed conflict, or victims of trafficking in persons. These are areas where there's constant work to try to reform the international system, but we think it's important to stand up and say this is wrong. We'll highlight the abuses and we'll continue to do it because we want that norm to get stronger and stronger. And so I'm hoping we'll be joined by other countries who have similar provisions in the way they stand up for sanctions. So we're putting teeth behind our decisions to say something is wrong. And that's a thing we will do. Again, it's separate from whether we're actually able to identify a person whose behavior we need to modify, or we can find and deny the resources. But it's important to stand up for the standards. This also goes beyond specific cases of human rights abuses or anti-corruption. It's important for the global economy. One of the struggles we'll all face is with the green transition, where we realize that many of the resources needed to build electric cars and other things are around the globe and often locked up in long-term contracts. Now, those contracts rest on a foundation often of corrupt behavior, odious labor practices, horrible environmental practices, and other things that make them vulnerable to something from sanctions. If we just simply designated the people who hold those contracts and tried to use it as a commercial tool, I don't think we'd be adding to the legitimacy of the international system. What we'd like to see is a strong set of norms and practices, ultimately rules, that govern the sort of contracts that allow for the global use of these commodities, also for the betterment of the people who live near where these things are brought out of the ground. So changing the supply chains that currently feed what's going to be critical for the green transition is an area where sanctions have a role, a supportive role, but an important role in clearing the way for an announcement of what the global standards are. Now, out of all that, whether it's in an economic case or human rights case, environmental or whatever, the point of this is that sanctions should be a piece of establishing stronger international norms. And that's a stance that the administration of which I'm part feels the US needs to play a strong voice in. But we can't do it alone. So we have to do this with our partners, because this is not an area where one party can simply declare what the rules are. So it's an area where we work very closely with the European Union, with our key allies in Europe, and with other major states around the world. And I think we'll try to do more of it as we go. Now, why I talk about these three things, and it may seem like I'm parsing a lot of confusing practice, but that's the beauty of a kind of common law method, right? You look through a whole burden of facts and you try to find the thread that helps to shape the next experiences where you apply it. So the idea of a norm is not that it's enforced in a situation where it's violated, but that it becomes the basis of practice going forward so that it doesn't need to be enforced. And one of the challenges for us will be articulating this and getting others to buy into these approaches as we go forward. For that to happen, we have to be clear about what we're trying to do. And I find it very clarifying if I can say, here we are trying to simply remove resources from a person who's seeking to violate a norm. Here we're engaged in a bit of a discussion, whether it's verbal or nonverbal, with the person subject to sanctions. And then here we're standing up and directly supporting a norm, one that's either already declared or one that's emerging from the practice that we're part of. If we know what we're trying to do, it becomes much more possible to understand whether the sanctions are effective. That's what I've tried to do by putting some framework around the Russia sanctions program and talking about how I evaluate it and how that affects how we pick our targets going forward. And that's what we'll try to do in all the other circumstances where US sanctions play a role. So with that, Yvonne?
Thank you very much. First, I do believe that if Krzysztof Michalski was going to look at it, he's going to be surprised that 10 years after his death, one of the most interesting talks are geopolitical talks. In a certain way, basically, it was assumed to be something different. Secondly, I'm really very grateful to Jim for this, because when we have been inviting him, at least my idea was we talk a lot of sanctions. Every week we talk about new sanctions. But what we are making out of this new weapon, because part of the story is that economic weapon, which is not invented in this war, became critically important, what it can achieve and what it cannot achieve. And I'll start with two things to go to the question. The economic weapon was very popular after World War I. In fact, basically, this is not the first time that we're talking about sanctions. During World War I, in many countries, there was a Ministry of Economic Blockades. And the major story was to deny you access to certain type of resources. So when the League of Nations was created, the major story was that the League of Nations does not have an enforcement mechanism. And the enforcement mechanism was believed to be economic sanctions that have been used for the first time massively during Italian campaign against Ethiopia. It didn't stop the war. And this is the first story. When basically before Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a major expectations about deterrence effect of sanctions. We're going to tell the Russians how the economy is going to suffer, and they're not going basically to invade. And my first question in a way, and I'm going to come with three questions so you can go on this, is it's very important also to know what sanctions cannot do. Because listening to you, and I do believe this is one of the first really conceptualized talk, exactly how the economic instrument and this kind of weapon works in the American diplomacy. But for me, this is the time effect. For example, Western sanctions hurt Russian economy. At the same time, Russian bombs hurt much more effectively Ukrainian economy, basically destroying 1/3 of the GDP of the country, just making cities totally non-existent. So from this point of view, this is the problem of the time factor. How you have this type of absolutely asymmetrical behavior, to what extent basically even the most effective economic sanctions can be successful in the moment of a real war. And I do believe this is quite important because this is also going probably to give us a possibility to see on the perspective of different parties. In a certain way, at least seen from somebody who is not a specialist on military stuff, I see President Putin saying, I'm going to increase the cost of the war. I'm going basically to bomb and to destroy and try to exhaust, hoping that at some point the Western support for Ukraine is going to decline. And then you have these 3, 4, 5 years in which, yes, your economy is going to decline, but on the other side, basically, probably on the battlefield, this is going to have a different dimensions. And I do believe this is particularly important because it's also very important, in my view, in moral terms, to tell also our populations, but also the Ukrainians, what they can expect from the economic weapon. My second question very much has to do with the effect on the global economy, because some historians claim that economic sanctions was also one of the way the international system was destroyed. Because basically, what you're doing is you create incentives in the government to create economies that approve to sanctions. If you basically, I believe that Americans are going to sanction me, I'm trying to create a world in which it's going to be difficult for them to do it. And from this point of view, I found particularly fascinating your idea is that you want to sanction, but at the same time trying to keep basically the global markets functioning. I'm asking this because we're still in an easy situation. But imagine that tomorrow we're going to discover, which some people are already saying that it is happening, that certain Chinese companies illegally are supplying parts for the Russian military industry. Then basically, in order to stop Russia access to this, we should go with the secondary sanctions. And if Russia is a big country, China is something totally different. How easy is to achieve this type of a balance in which you try to keep the global market and the global system in which part of the power of the West is, and at the same time having a policy that can create basically incentives for the others to try to deglobalize in a way that we don't want. And the third one goes with your third type of sanctions. And the third type of sanctions is very much what you were saying when you want to destroy certain type of bad equilibriums. And here comes the problem of the legitimacy of the American intervention. You are selective. You go on some countries and you don't go on others. You go on some actors and you don't go on others. And then the problem is particularly if this is not a collective sanction, which is supported by more countries, at some point you can produce a very strong sovereignist backlash politically. So as a result of it, seeing all these kind of real dilemmas, I'm very much interested after having this great presentation to try to see how these 3 questions are going to be basically reflected in your answers.
Those were directed to me. Look, these are all the hard questions, and I think sanctions are a tool. I'd hope at some point we'd see the amount of scrutiny that's directed at sanctions as a tool also done first to other individual tools. How often does diplomacy work? How often do track 2 things work? How often does war alone work? But it's really the integration that is the key across all of them. And I think sometimes my concern with the academic literature is that it tries to isolate just one tool as though it were the only action being taken. And that makes it as hard to evaluate as a football match by the quality of the shoe wear or something. It's not the full picture. But okay, let me try to see if I can remember the questions well enough to avoid them. You're completely right that in a sense this is a battle about time. President Putin clearly has decided that he wants everyone to suffer because he thinks he can suffer longer than everyone else. This is the strategy of boxers who end up in their early 40s with brain damage. It's not a way of building a healthy international system, so it's a very hard, it's difficult to constrain an actor who's made that sort of commitment. what role does sanctions play in this? I think, one, sanctions are a piece of the strategy. So what we're looking at, and you see in the headlines today, where the Russians are talking about a slow, gradual offensive, and letting it be known through their friends and allies that they're willing to do this a long time. And the Ukrainians are looking for decisive, quick blow. So that discussion happens publicly, but it doesn't happen only in the sanctions realm. It also involves military support, the civilian support to Ukraine so that it's able to sustain the economy it has. I think some of the other steps, and I didn't mention in the remarks, some of the steps that are taken on the humanitarian side to secure food exports from Ukraine, those are vital to the global south. Ukraine used to supply almost half the World Food Programme's annual supply of grain to the most needy in the world. And Russia stopped Ukraine from exporting at all. And it gradually crept up, often with some very great efforts by the European Union to allow exports into Poland and Slovakia, a little bit to Hungary, Romania, and increasingly then the UN deal that opened up the Black Sea again. So by the fall, Ukraine was exporting at pre-war levels or higher. Now Russia has again constricted that and has got Ukraine down to working at about half pre-war levels. The people who suffer from that are the people who buy Ukraine's food. And again, it was half the World Food Programme's supply in previous years. That's a choice by Russia. And it's partly sanctions that are allowing us to open that up, because Russia has come and said, we know you don't sanction our food and fertilizer, but sometimes it's difficult for us to move the money or move some goods that are locked up somewhere because of the owner of them. What we would like is some assistance so that we can move those goods to market, which means more food and fertilizer from Russia, but also from Ukraine. And so sanctions are a piece of kind of opening up the global marketplace. That's important to buy time. So what role does sanctions play? Well, partly by keeping the global markets open, we have more time to wage the war on the terms that the Ukrainians need to wage it. And I think part of what you see here is a choice by Putin. It's not that he entered this war and his strategy was to have this run. I don't believe. The strategy wasn't, let's go 2 to 3 years and show that I can suffer more. The strategy was to take Ukraine in 3 days, or Kyiv in 3
weeks,
days,
let's be fair.
maybe, and speed. They obeyed the speed limits, but it was a lightning decapitation strike followed by quick declaration of success. He's not doing that. Why not? Because he's losing. Now he's losing because of the courage and creativity of the Ukrainians, and now increasingly the support that we are all providing them, and that's forcing him to adopt this strategy. So he's playing with the one strength he has left, which is his belief that he can just wait this out. But that's in large part because the whole array of tactics we brought to bear have bought time to try to allow this war to end on the terms that Ukraine has said it wants, and that the global leadership has said Ukraine must win, Russia should suffer a strategic defeat. So you are absolutely right. The bet he is now making is that time is on his side. But he's making that bet because he lost the point that quick action was on his side. Now, the effect on the global economy, this actually, I would love, you should have Nick Mulder here. I've actually never met him, but it's a great book on the economic weapon. But I think he just didn't come forward far enough. So one of the things I've seen in my career is a real change in the composition of economic sanctions. So you're right, in World War I, it was blockades. And the idea was we would starve the Germans into submission, or the Germans would starve the British into submission. And I don't think that it's not seemed to have worked. Clearly something contributed to the war ending exactly when it did, maybe the arrival of American troops or the decay in the German economy. That was that lesson. There were reasons that the blockades of the 20s didn't work as much, but they're blunt weapons. And that was even true when I think about the wars in the former Yugoslavia, where the two Ivans and I and Misha were so involved, along with others here. At that time, the first reaction was that the UN put in place trade embargoes. And there were, blockades along the Drina River to try to keep goods from going from Serbia into Bosnia, and efforts to try to stop things from moving through eastern Slavonia. It's just a classical trade embargo. And one result from that was that the Serbian economy did begin to tank. It was mismanaged, but it also was suffering from the restrictions. And out of that, what you saw was that the people who controlled access to the economy were the ones who controlled the borders, right? And so kind of every product became cocaine. Now, toward the end of that decade, there was a real shift because many of the trade restrictions began to come off of all the economies as they implemented various peace deals. What we were left with were the financial sanctions and the restrictions on travel to a lesser extent, but really the financial sanctions were the items that could be very targeted on the ruling elite in the states and enabling for a much clearer message about the consequences of continued bad behavior and us being able to tweak them much more effectively. Now, what we've seen since that time, and it really came in the aftermath of 9/11, when the U.S. changed how we implement sanctions programs, we have tools to be much more surgical in the way we address the effects. Now, is that easy? No. But it means when we try to say sanctions do work or they don't work, and we look to examples, running back to the great blockades of history, including World War I, we're really talking about just fundamentally different things. Now, the challenge in the global economy now, one problem is once you disrupt a supply chain, the ripple effects just keep going on and on. And so you're always kind of remaking a suit that is unraveling, so maybe, well, anyway, I won't go through an example, but that's very difficult. And it means every day there can be a story of some disruption. So again, back to food and fertilizer. So there are no sanctions on Russian food and fertilizer. The Russians complain with some justification that the banks and the companies that sell or provide the finance for exports of Russian food and fertilizer are making less money than they did pre-war. Now, Russia is exporting as much food as it did pre-war. That's, I think, a tribute to the design of the sanctions programs and to Russia's relationship with its customers, though that mix is changing as well. But what the Russians point to is that as we have affected certain parts of the Russian establishment, some of the people who used to make money are making less. And I liken this to, complaining about like the window doesn't quite open as smoothly as it used to, but the house is now fundamentally sound. And there are always going to be examples like that, some much more serious, once you start to change a supply chain. Now, how do we fix this? We don't want a global economy that is sort of endlessly dependent on the intervention of, bureaucrats like me, trying to say, you get a license, you get this, you get that. What we need to do is create a set of incentives so that actors understand that if they act in accordance with the rules, they will be able to make decisions freely and in their own commercial interest. So again, we've done that in the food and fertilizer area, where we issued a set of what we call general licenses. So basically saying to people, if you behave in the following ways, you can just go ahead and act like a normal commercial actor. And it restored a bit of stability to the global food markets. Prices came down a few percent after that happened. Now the UK has joined, the EU is slowly getting a process like that in place. And the result is you can have a normal market, but one that's rooted in a set of rules that are things we can support. So that's a piece of what we're trying to do in addressing the global economy. Now to the legitimacy of U.S. intervention. And Ivan is famous for running a project he called the Hypocrisy Project, which mostly involved bringing unsuspecting Americans in front of people angry at our various interventions, either because we had intervened where they didn't want us to, or we had failed to intervene where they thought we should have instead. And so this is a long time conversation. And I think to some extent, there is no simple way of addressing that. What I tried to say by the third role that I think sanctions play is that we want to leave the international system stronger. So when we intervene somewhere, we're doing it on behalf of global norms of anti-corruption. We're doing it on behalf of global norms against sexual violence and armed conflict, so that at the end, it's not seen as exclusively a sort of American whim or an American-European whim, but we're standing up for, as we are in Ukraine, the territorial integrity and political independence of a state, right? There's an icy judgment that tells Russia, stop doing this. It's not stopping. And so those are the conditions in which we try to work. And I'll kind of close with a couple points in this. As a part of that, I think we have a duty to articulate the rules we think we're enforcing. And I think this is a place where I, just as a human, don't do enough. But we need to start saying these are the norms we want to enforce, because that's the only way that norms become real, right? They have to be articulated, repeated by others, applied and adapted in contexts. And the more that we do that, then one intervention, one place, will have a demonstration effect elsewhere, can be applied by others. And again, the goal of a norm is not to have it enforced again and again. The goal of a norm is to have it become normal. And so that's the goal here, so that it's less about our interventions, it's more about people's behavior adapting. I'm going to make a final, slightly catty point. There's a self-defeating element to this sort of easy criticism from, oppressive, populist politicians, in that here, part of their tactic is to say that, everything is possible, nothing is true, right? And so they kind of don't believe in process. And so I see in my job, we talk to civil society groups, we'll take calls from journalists, with everyone who can say to us, here's a place where there is behavior that is sanctionable happening. And we investigate it, we come up with our own evidence. But that commitment to evidence and process is really only valued on one side of this debate. The other people kind of just say, yeah, well, you do it too. But they have no evidence for it. They don't care about the process. They don't engage in it. And at some point, maybe because I've spent most of my career working in jobs where I think process and an adversarial discussion and transparency are really important, the fact that the critics of this effort are just kind of, just want to thumb their nose and walk away, but not engage at all, I think it undermines the seriousness of their cause. Now, does it mean some people are willing to accept it from time to time? Yes, absolutely. But it means I think they should be taken less seriously than they claim to be often.
Thank you very much. And we are going, because we have an incredible audience, so I'll go to the audience. And I'm really very grateful to Jim, because in political science textbooks, there is one important thing. What is a policy? And the policy is what governments do, but also how they justify their actions. So one and the same action justified with a different argument is a different policy. And from this point of view, for me, it's very important, because at least for the first time, I can see a clear explanation of sanction policy of the United States. So here we have two options, and you should make a choice. We can ask every question you want to answer, or we're going to get 3 of them. I don't know how many people are planning to quote. I see 2 of them on the first row already, and 1 there, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and stop here. So
if you do even 3, I'm not going to remember all of them.
okay, so then one by one.
Or why don't we try to maybe group 2 or 3, and I'll do it.
Okay, let's go with the first row.
Yeah.
Let's start with Misha and Michael, and you're going to answer.
Thanks very much, Ivan. Jim, how much disappointment is there in the administration when you see countries that the United States have invested quite a lot of political capital in, such as the Emirates, using their facilities as a way for Russians, quite simply, to park their money, to process their money, and issues like the reflagging of ships, with the involvement of, for example, companies in Dubai. Is that a deep frustration? Because I look at the Middle East and 1 or 2 other areas and see that the United States isn't quite as able to persuade as it once was these countries to engage in this complex process of sanctions. And
when was the period we were so persuasive?
I think you were more persuasive in the past. I mean, I can't remember of an issue to do with sanctions. It's fairly true, but you have pretty close relations with With the Saudis, certainly, and with the Emirates.
So like during the 1973 oil crisis.
Well, you certainly managed that very well in the end in terms of what you got out of it.
I think, okay, it's a fair question, but why don't we take another as well? Sorry for the
Michael.
teasing. Yeah.
Jim, that was a fascinating and lucid discussion. What about China? This is a delicate subject for you to talk about, obviously, but my question is, what evidence do you have that the Chinese, either directly or through intermediaries, are passing sophisticated chips and advanced technologies to the Russians to make up for the defects that you pointed out that are tending to create a certain pattern of World War I warfare? What is the risk that the Chinese will enable the Russians medium term to fight a 21st century war, which would then change the strategic balance?
Thank you. Are you going to shoot the balloon? Please.
Yeah, these are two questions. So one, so the question of what we might say are the states that are the open, I don't even fence sitters, but I certainly don't feel frustration. I think this is a normal part of growing healthy relationships. And we're being very clear about behavior that we expect and behavior that's unacceptable, and they have to make some choices. We make choices. But for the most part, the relationship with the Emirates is, very deep and varied. There are areas where we're very closely aligned and areas where we disagree. That's typical of our relationships with Europe, of others around the world. So part of my teasing during the question is, you can point in almost any relationship to some deep disagreement that rives the societies. And I don't see the deep disagreement around this. What we see with, say, the Emirates in particular is, much like another country in which we may be sitting, their avowed policy at the beginning was neutrality, but it's not impartiality. They've voted in favor of Ukraine in condemning Russia's invasion and condemning the atrocities. And they've provided humanitarian support. They've provided a certain amount of other support. The Russians who have fled Russia need someplace to live. And if the behavior isn't supporting the Russian war machine or otherwise violating the sanctions, I think it's a normal part of kind of the movement in a situation like this. I don't want to diminish the degree of differences, but they're part of a healthy conversation. And I don't want to just focus on one country. There are multiple countries. You see a lot of countries that are maybe more exposed to Russian behavior that are open to having a discussion of how they can create new markets or create new engagements in a way that wasn't imaginable a year or two ago. And we're in the process of creating those. So I think when you're in mid-foundation, it always looks incredibly messy. And there are some constituencies in every society that hold to a particular view, but you kind of find your way forward. I feel pretty good. I was with some colleagues and visiting a few of these countries, and I think the engagements are very blunt. We try to be clear about what's acceptable, what's not. And I think what we're seeing right now is that the sanctions are evolving and the rules are getting a little tougher. So last year, and this will move over into Michael's question, last year, it was acceptable for a lot of consumer-grade electronics to go to Russia from states that didn't have other prohibitions. So Europe, the G7 had prohibitions on direct trade with Russia, but we could trade with Turkey, with Central Asia, with other countries, and then have that end up in Russia. It's legal. It's not so much anymore. The European Union, with the ninth package in December, and what I expect to see them do, will start to make much of that trade no longer allowed. So for the countries who have expansive relationships with Russia or with Russian companies, they're going to have to adjust to a new reality. So much of our conversation is not to say that we disagree about this or that, but to say, now the changes, it's a new situation. let's figure out how we work in this one. So if we are clear and we are adaptable but still clear, then I think the conversations are good ones. China, to me, one of the more fascinating elements of the discussions with China was the interpretation of the February 4th, 2022, letter of friendship. And there's a fascinating article by a linguist who works Chinese and Russian, points out that for the Russians, this was a commitment of great friendship. For the Chinese, it was a statement of friendliness. And I think we see that in the different interpretations. To this point, China has not made this their war. And they certainly trade extensively with Russia. They're benefiting from Russia having to sell a great deal of its commodities to China, often at cut rate prices. The Chinese are not subsidizing the Russian war by paying over the price. In fact, they're negotiating very tough deals in every way we can see. The trade that they have with Russia, they've become a more important trading partner in most components of electronics. This is public data. It's a little bit hard to parse. At one point, some set of it caused State Department computers to crash. But it's, the voluminous customs and trade data. And when you look at it, although it's not declared in the same way between China and Russia as it is elsewhere, it's available. And what it tells you is China's exporting kind of semiconductors, chips, and other things. Now, are they as good as what they could buy from many of our countries in the European Union, the United States? I'd say no. That's, I think, a judgment on the Chinese part about what will be available and what will not be. Will they continue to hold that line? I think that's the subject of many of the diplomatic conversations that'll be taking place, over time. We've made very clear our position on that, and we'll see where that takes us as we go forward. But you're right; it's one of the signal questions about the further pattern of the war.
Thank you very much. On the next round, we're going to sanction long answers. So Stefan, Lene, and then
Only way of surviving.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Jim, you were sort
Hey,
of
Stefan.
hi. You were sort of dismissive about GDP numbers because you said, well, if they invest a lot in the war economy, the GDP goes up anyway. But still, I saw the IMF figures for the next for last year and the next 2 years, and I think the Russian GDP declined by 2.2% in 22. It's expected to rise by 0.3% in 23, which is more than the Eurozone and the UK. And it will go up to 2.4% in the year 2004, which again is better than the predictions for many European countries. Now, the problem is probably not so much that this says a lot about the capacity of the Russia to fight a successful war, but psychologically it's still a big blow, isn't it? Because ultimately, I think many people will think this is obviously not working, right? And the other question that I have, and this relates a little bit to what Misha said before, I was a bit surprised that 141 countries voted to condemn the invasion, but less than 50 countries actually participate in the sanctions system. And you also, with any kind of sanction regime, you have a constant decay. Basically, the sanctioned party knows and learns how to work around it. And I was wondering if we were not successful in bringing about regime change in Syria, because it had the support from Russia and Iran. We are not working on regime change in Russia, evidently, but clearly Russia is a totally different actor with a completely different capacity. So without sufficiently broad support in the international community, I'm afraid there is a big risk that the sanctions over time will actually get rather weaker than stronger.
Slavek, let's take two, Slavek Shirakovsky, and then we're going to come.
Hello, thanks a lot for the great presentation. There is a third country that takes part in this war and is one of the top producers of fertilizers in the world, which is Belarus. And my question to you is, to what extent your distributions of sanctions, by you, I mean you are like the states and your EU partners, in a shaping sanctions on Belarus and on Russia in a slightly different way, can be an efficient tool to divide Lukashenko from Putin and to prevent Belarusian army to join Russian army and attack Kyiv from the north and entire western Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Jim.
I think all of the questions boil down to let's be clear what we can do and what we're aiming to do. So as I said at the beginning, Stefan, I think what we want to do is deny resources related to the war. And that's my laser focus, which is different from denying resources from the civilian population or some of the other programs that you talked about. I think on the participation in the sanctions program and the risk of decay, at the moment, I see much more appetite to make these effective, keep evolving. So what we're seeing is, Russia found ways to get access to certain electronics after the first round of sanctions was legal. We're adjusting the program. There's nothing but enthusiasm to be effective, and it's very interesting. There's none of the usual sort of saying, protect my company, protect my product, do this. It's a shared approach, and that's very encouraging. Maybe that's partly because for what Russia most needs, it's a smaller set of countries. It may not matter that some of the far-flung countries sign up to stop exports of something they don't make anyway. And so this is a bit of a different conversation. But it's a challenge, and it's very important that as much of the world as possible continue to condemn Russian invasion and stand by us. So one place there will be for us an important moment is Russia has threatened again to stop Ukrainian grain exports through Odessa. That's where the low-cost food goes to the World Food Program. Now, each time this has happened before, our voice has not been what's persuaded Russia. It's been the G20. It's been Prime Minister Modi. It's been President Erdogan and the President of Indonesia and others saying you have to allow this to go forward. And I expect we'll see something like that again. So everybody plays in this in a different space and in a different way, but the way it adds up is in those three purposes I talked about: maintaining the global markets, reducing our reliance, reducing Russia's access to resources. Is that reducible to one number in a vote? No, that's part of the challenge. The question on Belarus, I think as well, we're very concerned with basically after the 2020 presidential elections, Lukashenko came to be much more dependent on Putin than he'd ever wanted to be. And I'm not sure that sanctions are the tool that will divide them. Now, is he willing to risk his entire rule for this war? I think that's a decision that's rooted in a combination of his own judgment and then broader diplomacy, the role of sanctions and other bits. We are concerned that Belarus is allowing itself to be used as a transit place by Russia to bring in goods that Russia shouldn't have, and I think you'll see some move there to align the sanctions programs, but how that affects the relationship, I think it will make clear that there are real costs toward the alignment that he's already put in place. And that's one factor he'll have to consider in whether he wants to tighten that alignment or not. Is that by itself enough? That's something we'll see, but it will be one factor among many.
So we are going to get basically then I'm going to ask people really to be very, very fast, and then you're going to have one. Yeah, no, we have 10, 15. Let's go by this. Everybody can have his 30 seconds. Let's start with Mark and then the ambassador. Yeah.
Hi, Mark Leonard from the European Council on Foreign Relations. I'll be very quick. Ivan asked about the impact on the global system. I mean, how do you see these sanctions impacting on China in its thinking about its geopolitical priorities? how concerned are you that we are speeding up de-dollarization and sort of further fragmentation of the global financial system?
Please. Yeah, it's you.
Very brief, Gudrun Steinacker, former German ambassador. I just visited Serbia 2 weeks ago, and I heard from a very good source that Serbia is actually a hub for dual-use goods, for trading dual-use goods to Russia. And what are you going to do about it?
Thank you very much. Please, yeah.
Thanks very much for coming to Vienna, and I commend the administration for sending me here to have this conversation. The Prime Minister of Finland was asked about Biden's kind of balloon that Putin needs an off-ramp in the war. She said, the way to end the war is for Putin to leave. And then I saw an American comment said, yes, this could be summarized as speak loudly and carry someone else's stick. Germany wouldn't send tanks to Ukraine without America's sign-off, and they sent less than 10, I think, and the U.S. sent several more. Albridge Colby has said that the U.S. shouldn't really be involved in this war, crystallizing the question, is it time for Europe to get its own stick, and how big should that stick be?
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. I have a point to make about social bubbles, echo chambers, and Platonian caves. Because when I look at the Western world from above and outside, I see you vegetating in such a Platonian cave. What I mean by that, when I see inside from above, is the most stunning type of Western hypocrisy and double standards, also briefly mentioned. So what I mean by that, let's go through the things you said. This is an imperial project in Europe. Of course, Russia has an imperial project, but there's another imperial project in Europe, which is, of course, the US imperial project in Europe, which also has interests in Ukraine, for once. Reducing reliance on Russian energy. Yes, Europe has reduced its reliance on Russian energy, and at the same time, it has become more reliant on more expensive US energy. Also goes unmentioned. Another double standard, very interesting. Then you talk about law, the importance of law, but you forget to mention that your sanctions regime is completely lawless for the most part. It doesn't rest on international law. It rests on the so-called rules-based order, which is actually a pretense of international law, while at the same time undermining it. The list goes on and on. And in light of that, why shouldn't we sanction your empire, the rest of the world? I mean, we've got until the point that you learn to behave on the international stage. Look at what it did to Iraq, look at what it did to Libya, Syria, the list is endless, Vietnam. Why shouldn't we sanction you? I think we've got a very good moral cause for doing that.
Good. And Kirill was also interested. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for a brilliant presentation. My name is Kirill Rogov, and I'm from Russia. Yes, it is really very persuasive and interesting to understand the logic of policy, of sanction policy. And my question is not about short-term, but about long-term scenarios. What scenarios you see more probable for Russia in the long term? Because I'll just say the most important part of this question. It is because the most impressive and most visible examples of sanctions in the long term are Iran and North Korea. And in both cases, we see that it leads to conservation of the regime, to formation of the economy of resistance, some capsulation. And in case of Russia, it will be capsulation of the, while Iran also just looking for nuclear weapons. In case of Russia, it will be enough nuclear weapons within this. And I see this the most probable scenario. And the other part of the story is that Russia will not be alone, but it will be with some ally, China. Russia will become more and more dependent from China and more became a part of it in political and military sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have a good question. Some of them were very clear.
So
it's disorienting to see Mark Leonard speak, since I most often, hear him in my headphones from the podcast. The effect on China, I'm very hesitant to draw direct lessons or to offer any speculation about China. I do think the challenge of the central role the dollar plays in the global economy is one that gets addressed in a number of fora and for a number of reasons. This is one factor, but I don't see it as the central piece. And for me, the central role of the dollar in the global economy stems from our success in holding ourselves to a rule of law. So in part, I'm answering the hypocrisy question, at least initially. I think the attractiveness of the dollar is that people believe when they put money in our system, they'll get treated fairly. And that's unlike a lot of other currencies. Now, it's true of the euro, and it's true of the pound, but whether there's the strength in those economies and those currencies, will also be a significant factor. So I think that's a much wider conversation than just this. On the point about Serbia, this is also public data. Now, it takes time to get the import-export data, so we're always working a bit on a lag. What is true is that exports, frankly, from the G7 to intermediary countries like Serbia went up greatly in the fall. Now, many of those products no longer will be allowed to export. Serbia also saw then a big uptick in taking the same tariff codes and having the products go on to Russia. The volumes were fairly small, to be honest, but yes, it was happening. Now, how will we handle that? Well, the first thing is we have a sort of very clear conversation about what's allowed and what's not going forward. Now the rules are clear, and I think that will have an impact on what they're able to do. But they were not unique, also not surprising. And so it'll be a conversation that we have. Does Europe need to get its own stick? I'm the sanctions guy. So I think in this case, I think one of the remarkable things we're seeing out of this conflict is that Europe is kind of getting its own stick, militarily. The commitments to defense improvement, including this country, are pretty remarkable. But as well, the use of the economic tools by Europe are pretty stunning. I was speaking to a senior European official last week who said he came into the job in sanctions thinking that his job was to write rules against the coercive use of US sanctions, and instead he's now actively engaged in developing the tools for Europe to apply sanctions much more effectively itself. And so I think in some sense, yes, we're seeing Europe acting as a geopolitical actor, admittedly on its doorstep, but I think it's a pretty remarkable shift. And what that will mean for the next several years, I think, is one of the foundational questions as we go forward. The question of Western hypocrisy, look, I've opposed many of the things that you criticized. That's a beauty of living in my country, where I can go in and out of my government and try to act one way and not act another, and I don't have to leave my country. So I'm very proud of it for that. And I think this is a case where you win the debate every day. You don't win it with everyone every day, but our point is we have to stand up for rules that other people want to join us in. And in this case, all of the countries who contribute and benefit from a particular rule-based system are standing with us in opposition to Russia's unjustified invasion. And that I will take as a statement of legitimacy to carry this out. Instead, if you wish to stand by what we're seeing in Bakhmut, what we've seen in the destroyed towns, what we saw in Bucha, if that's your defense of a system that should stand up against us, then I think you should say that. I don't know why you claim to get to stand outside the cave. You're in the cave with the rest of us, seeing the shadows that appeal to you. And I think, look at the entire picture. And if I can stand and vindicate the victims of Bucha rather than the perpetrators of Bucha, I'll take it. I'll take your criticism too. But I'm very proud of the stance that we're taking with our allies. Now, to Kirill, in the sense of Russian scenarios, I don't have a crystal ball. As I said at the beginning, in this case, unlike other sanctions programs, we very much want Russia to participate in the global economy. And that I think is a real difference because it allows for Russians to participate in the global economy. This is President Putin's war. And we want that to be an outcome of this. So it's not an effort to see a hermetic society at the end of it, but a society that's engaged in an acceptable way, but one that doesn't allow it to coerce its neighbors. And where that will lead us, that's a place we will have to see as we work our way through. And what that will mean for Russians, I think, is something you can tell me a lot more about. So hopefully we'll get a chance to have that conversation.
Thank you very much, Jim. And thank you, because I do believe this is one of the, at least our ambitions when we started this, to get something serious to start a discussion. And I do believe this is the first discussion, because where I very much agree with Stefan is there was an expectations after 1 year, Russian GDP is going to collapse 10% and so on. And then people cannot understand what all this is about. And in my view, this is very important to know what the thing is about, what can be achieved and what cannot be achieved. So I very much want to thank you for starting this conversation, knowing that starting a conversation when you're in government is very difficult. And I want also to very much congratulate your career, because this is the joke that I kept for the end. During the Obama administration, Jim O'Brien was special envoy for releasing hostages. So now he's in the business of taking hostages. Thank you. Okay.